Hi, I'm Mary Claire Speckner with the Bartholomew County Public Library, and I want to welcome you to tonight's event, Archaeology, Your Community. But before we start, I want to recognize Stephanie Merrifield in our digital underground who is powering tonight's event. So thank you, Stephanie. September is Archaeology Month in our state, and tonight we have Rachel Sharkey, who is a research archaeologist with the Indiana Division of Historic Preservation and Archaeology presenting for us. If you have any questions during the program, type them in the comments section and we will get those to Rachel. So over to you, Rachel.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for having me. As Mary Claire said, I am Rachel Sharkey. I am a research archaeologist with the Division of Historic Preservation and Archaeology. That's quite a mouthful. So if I talk about our office, you might hear me refer to it as DHPA. But basically, we're the regulatory body for archaeology in the state. We don't only focus on archaeology, we also focus on historic structures and other above ground resources that are important to our cultural heritage. But my focus is more on the things that are below the ground. So I will share my screen with you and we will talk about the archaeology side of things. Right, as I said, I'm part of the Division of Historic Preservation and Archaeology. We're actually a subset of the Department of Natural Resources. A lot of people don't realize we're there, but we are. And we focus on the cultural heritage and the cultural resources in our state. Some of the things that we are going to cover today include what is archaeology. We'll cover some of the myths and the realities of the field. We're also going to talk about what cultures were in Indiana in the past. So there's more to Indiana than just the pioneers and the settlers and the stuff that we think of in more recent memory. There were people here long before those people came to the state. We will also talk about laws regarding archaeological sites in Indiana and those laws that are revolving around collecting artifacts. We'll also talk about how you, the public, can become involved. We want you to know about archaeology and our cultural heritage, and we would love for you to be more involved. So some of the myths surrounding archaeology. First, is it digging up dinosaurs? If you said no, you're right. Archaeology is not about digging up dinosaurs. That is actually paleontology. So archaeology and paleontology get confused a lot. Paleontology does deal with digging up fossils and looking at the prehistoric millions of years ago past. Archaeology looks at things that are a little more recent, and I'll talk about the differences between the two in more detail. Now, there's my little no dinosaur sign, just to drive that point home. Are there archaeological sites in Indiana, and are they important? Yes and yes. There are lots of sites in Indiana. We'll talk about how many and what constitutes a site. And are they important? Incredibly important, even the little ones, because they tell us about how people were using our land and the state for thousands of years. Do archaeologists get to keep what they find? No, we don't. We're not Indiana Jones. We're not, we don't get to do the fun stuff that he does. We don't keep our finds. If we find anything, it immediately is first dibs to the property owner of where we find it. And if they decide they don't want it, it goes to a museum. So we don't get to keep anything that we find. We find some cool stuff, have to hand it over. It's kind of a bummer at times. Are sites protected in Indiana? Absolutely. We have some of the most stringent laws that actually protect burial sites and archaeological sites in the state. So what is archaeology? So archaeology is the anthropological study of past lifeways, cultures, and cultural processes through the investigation of material remains left behind by humans. So this is just a really long, wordy way of saying archaeologists study the trash that people have left behind, or just the material culture or the things that people have left behind. So that's the biggest difference between archaeology and paleontology. Paleontologists study fossils, so mainly dinosaurs, plants, invertebrates, ocean animals, and archaeologists study the things that people leave behind. So some of the things that we look for as archaeologists include artifacts and features. Artifacts are any portable object made, used, or modified by humans. And I've got some examples that I'll show you here in a minute. Features are non-portable evidence of past human behavior, activity, and technology found on or in the ground. So basically, artifacts you can pick up and carry along with you. Features stay put. Now, if you have one or more artifacts or features, we in Indiana consider that an archaeological site. So Indiana is kind of rare in that we consider a single artifact, or what we call an isolated find, an archaeological site. Some states require it to be 3 or 4 artifacts before they give it the name archaeological site. But we think every artifact is important, therefore every one is a site. So in the picture in the center of the screen here, we see a single projectile point laying on the ground. So in here in Indiana, that would be a site. Sites can be a little more obvious than just a point laying on the ground. It could be things like historic cabin sites, Native American earthworks, like we see in the bottom right corner of our screen. Canal sites are archaeological sites, cemeteries, shipwrecks. You might be surprised to learn that there are actually shipwrecks in Indiana, and I'll give you a really cool resource to learn more about those later. And generally, we have general sites that we just call artifact scatters. And these are exactly how they sound. It's just a scattering of artifacts on the surface of the ground. And there's no associated structures or features that really give us more insight as to what was going on there. These are probably the most common type of site in Indiana, just these scatters. But they're often the least recognized. So here's some examples of artifacts that you might find in Indiana. So starting with the upper left image, we have here what we call chert debitage. The chert is a stone that is utilized to make projectile points. It's also known as flint. You might have recognized it as that. And this stone is special because when you hit it, it flakes off, almost like glass flakes when you hit it. And therefore, it's able to be shaped into things like projectile points, which we see on the bottom left of the screen. These points that we see here are from the woodland period, which is about 1,000 to 1,500 years ago. In the center left, we see a pestle. So if you have a mortar and pestle in your kitchen that you use to grind up sauces or herbs or spices, this is the same idea. These actually appeared probably in the Archaic period, which was 3,000 to 10,000 years ago, in order to process foods. In the upper center on the right, we have a piece of looks like a large mammal bone. It might be part of a deer bone. We look at the bones of animals at archaeological sites in order to understand what types of things people were eating, what types of animals were they associating with, and things like that. So even other organic material can give us information about people of the past. The bottom center underneath that bone is, it looks like cut nails, so from the historic era. And then on the right side of the screen, we have glass bottles and ceramics, probably indicative of a historic era house site or industrial site. So we have a whole range of artifacts that we can find here in Indiana. So if you remember, features are evidence of human behavior that you can't pick up and take with you. They stay in the ground. So some examples of historic era features would be things like house foundations, wells. Here on the left, we have an eroded lime kiln. So you can kind of see the U-shaped, the U-shape of it, where you can see the base of the kiln kind of going across the center of the image, and then the walls heading up on either side. And then on the right side of the screen, we have a cistern, which was associated with a historic house, and the cisterns would have been used for storage of water. So these are things that we find regularly. The lime kilns are especially found near the Ohio River in Indiana. Some examples of pre-contact features or Native American features would be things like hearths, post holes for house structures. Very rarely we find rock art. Often there are some examples of rock art here in Indiana, but most often that's found out west. And so knowing what we know about features and knowing what we know about artifacts, and that Indiana considers a single artifact a site, how many sites do you think are in Indiana? Well, it's probably more than you think. Indiana has over 73,000 recorded archaeological sites, and really only a fraction of the state has been surveyed by professional archaeologists. These sites get reported to us through professional investigations. They get reported to us through the literature, so old county surveys and resources like that mention archaeological sites when people were first visiting the state. And then also collectors and avocational archaeologists will let us know about the sites, and then we can get them documented and protected. So it's important, if you do know of a site, let us know about it. That way we can keep it around. So of those 73,000 sites in Bartholomew County, we have 1,541 currently recorded sites in Bartholomew County. And generally, these are similar to those recorded in other counties. There's a variety of prehistoric and historic sites. Pre-contact, that should say pre-contact and historic sites. And I would say a majority of the sites in Bartholomew County were recorded as a result of surveys done at Camp Atterbury. That was a very large and in-depth project. So sites in Bartholomew County are discovered or investigated due to a whole variety of reasons, and this actually applies to the state as a whole. Most often, sites are recorded because of Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. I'm going to talk about this act a little bit because it's near and dear to my heart, because it's why my office exists, but it's really important. So Section 106 of the NHPA, or the National Historic Preservation Act, the whole act was established in 1966, but the act created state historic preservation offices, or SHPOs. That's what my office is. So we are Indiana's State Historic Preservation Office. Our job is to look at any project involving federal funding, licensing, or permitting, and to make sure it's not going to impact cultural resources. That's why the act was enacted, I suppose. in order to protect cultural resources such as historic structures and archaeological sites. So the majority of what we do and how we find sites is part of the Section 106 process. So people go out and they basically will look for the presence of sites or historic structures in the path of a project, like a road project or a cell tower or anything that gets federal involvement. There are also state laws protecting archaeological sites in Indiana. If you are a law nerd, like some of us are, you can look it up and read about it. You would want to look up Indiana Code 1421.1, and it'll all be there for you. Archaeological sites are also documented due to research interests of professional archaeologists and academic archaeologists at our universities, and also as a result of grants. One of our office's jobs is to help issue the Historic Preservation Fund grant. This grant is funded through the National Park Service, but then basically managed through the SHPOs. Also, there's always the possibility of what we call accidental discoveries. So sometimes things pop up and we didn't know they were there, and then we have to go out and deal with them. When I was in graduate school, I actually dealt with a few accidental discoveries in Bartholomew County. So I'm familiar with those, especially in this area. So what are we looking for? What are these prehistoric or historic things that we're talking about? Well, we can classify the pre-contact cultures of Indiana into basically 4 primary groups. This image here actually divides them into a little more specific subsets, but generally we group the pre-contact cultures of Indiana into the Paleo-Indians, which were about 10 to 12,000 years ago. They were the first people here in Indiana. Then the Archaic period, which is about 3,000 to 10,000 years ago. During the Archaic period, people started to become sedentary. So that meant they were creating camps and living in places seasonally. The Paleo Indians were much more nomadic and kind of followed food where they needed to go. They lived in small groups. In the Archaic period, the group sizes were increasing and they were settling down a little bit more. Then we get to the Woodland period. In the Woodland, you're starting to get a very settled culture. You see mounds start to be built, so ceremonial mounds, and you really start to see the presence of pottery. So if we run into an archaeological site and there's pottery, most often it's at least, or at most, as old as the Woodland period, and maybe Mississippian, because they also had pottery. So the Mississippian period was the most recent of the pre-contact periods, and those people were the people of Angel Mounds in Evansville. They had a fully developed society with a hierarchy of power, and basically these were the people that were the immediate ancestors to the people, and may have even been the people that the first European settlers in Indiana encountered. After 1650, we consider that the historic era in Indiana. So how do we find this stuff? Well, there's a whole archaeological process. Archaeology is a science. Some people say it's a soft science, but I say it's a science. So the archaeological process is much like the scientific method. We have to ask a question and test our hypothesis and perform an experiment, and then test our results, and it has to be replicable. So in archaeology, we do research, we do field work, we do laboratory work, we do more research to learn about the things that we found. And then we write about what we have found. And that's really the most important step, because if we dig things up and we sit them on a shelf and we never tell anyone about them, what's the point? And that's a little soapbox I like to stand on. We need to let people know what we're finding and educate people about what we're finding, because otherwise there's no point in doing it. So first step is research. We look into, we do a background check basically on anywhere that we want to dig. We don't just start digging willy-nilly across the state. We look and ask ourselves a few questions, such as, has work been done here before? And not just archaeological work, but has there been construction? The likelihood of finding an archaeological site in somewhere that's been heavily developed for, tens of years is pretty low. Are there already sites there? So if I'm going to be doing a project, am I going to be putting that project in an archaeological site? That's important information. Is there the potential for finding archaeological resources? Some areas just don't have high potential. Like I said, urban settings may not have high potential. Swampy areas, no one wants to live in a swamp, probably a pretty low potential. So those are things that we consider when we're doing our work. One other thing that we always check, and part of my office is, it's one of our initiatives that we really promote, is our online database that we call SHARD. It's the State Historic, Architectural, and Archaeological Research Database. You can see why we call it SHARD. But basically, SHARD includes all the archaeological information that we have in paper form, in digital form, that you can access via the web. Now, there's a big caveat there. You have to be a professional archaeologist to see the archaeological information. Now, if you have an interest in historic structures or cemeteries or any above ground resource, that information is public information, and you can see that in SHARD. So I'm not saying SHARD's not for you, just we keep the archaeological information in a locked portion of the database in order to protect those site locations. So the first step of once we go out in the field is to do what we consider archaeological survey. So this is literally just looking at the ground and trying to see if there's any artifacts or features there. We also call it reconnaissance or pedestrian survey. And the image on the screen shows people literally walking in a line. You do it at an even interval. So you have to be able to walk in a straight line to do this. But you walk, in this case, a field, and you look for any evidence of archaeological resources on the surface. Now, let's say you're in a field, or I'm sorry, a yard or some in the middle of the woods and you can't see the surface, then we do what is called a shovel test survey. So it's the same idea. We set up a grid with even intervals and we do little shovel test pits and to look for any artifacts or features that might be below the surface and below the ground cover. We also call this phase 1 survey. So beyond a phase 1 survey, which again is just looking to see if things are there, are excavations. And there's 2 different phases of excavations. There's phase 2, which is basically small scale excavations in order to assess the importance of a site. And then phase 3 excavations. And phase 3 excavations are actually pretty rare. They're full excavations of the entire archaeological site. This is really only done when a site is in danger of being destroyed or cannot be avoided by a project like a road or a casino or um, some large project like that. So those are some of the reasons that phase 3s are done. These can also be done for academic interest because they are very, they're much more detailed and you get much more finite information. So one thing we have to keep in mind as archaeologists is archaeology is actually a destructive science. Once you dig something up and then sift it through those screens like we see on the upper right there, the site doesn't look the same. We have changed it. So we have to keep in mind that by doing archaeology at a site, we're actually changing the site. And so we have to be very meticulous with all the notes that we take and all the information that we record. There are ways of looking under the surface of the ground without actually digging. So here on the left, we see that little lawnmower looking machine. That's a ground penetrating radar. And so it sends radar, it sends waves into the ground. And you see in the lower left there, you get these little blips. And the little blips tell you, oh, there might be something here. So it's not like CSI or Bones where you get like the glorious picture of what's exactly under the ground. It's a little more abstract and you pretty much have to determine, oh, is that blip something I'm interested in? Now, GPR is really great for historic cemeteries because not all graves don't necessarily have tombstones. A lot of times they just get lost to time. And so you can use GPR in historic cemeteries in order to find people that may not be marked. It's really great for that use. You can see it being used in a cemetery in that photo. Now on the right, that device is called a magnetometer. It is similar to the GPR in that it sends waves into the ground. It looks for different signatures and you get a slightly different picture. So the picture that we're seeing on the lower left there are actually mound or enclosures, or Native American mounds or enclosures. I think they're actually from Ohio, not Indiana. But you can see the definite shape of those. And I believe this case, it was a flat field, but it shows you that there's still the presence of archaeological resources under the surface there. That's really cool technology. Once we're done digging, we take things back to the lab. We actually spend most of our time in the lab, either writing or researching or cleaning the artifacts. I would say actually being in the field and doing excavations is the smallest portion of our time spent for this job. Oh, excuse me, I'm going to back that up again. So when we get things to the lab, first step is to clean them. I have the picture of the toothbrushes there because archaeologists are very particular about their preferred toothbrush for cleaning artifacts. But we use toothbrushes to clean them because the toothbrushes can get in all the little nooks and crannies really well and really clean the artifacts. You can see the pictures at the bottom of the screen. We have a pile of dirty chert on the left and then a pile of clean chert on the right. You can just really see how the color develops on the chert, and there's other features of the stone that we can pick up on once they've been cleaned. We also take the artifacts and sort them by type. So all glass artifacts will be grouped together, all chert artifacts, all metal artifacts. So we sort them and then we take the time to research into what they are. And we write all that information onto a catalog, which is really tiny in the upper right here. But again, we have to be very meticulous and record all the information that we can because, if something happens to that artifact, then there's no record of it ever again. Each artifact gets its own identification number. Each site also has its own identification number. So if an artifact gets separated from its collection, we know exactly where it belongs. And we actually take little super fine tip pins and write those numbers onto the artifact, which you can see in the lower right there. Part of the research we do when we're looking into what artifacts are. This is why historic artifacts are pretty cool, is we have cheat sheets. We have catalogs that tell us exactly when and where things were made. And then we have maker's marks like we see on that piece of ironstone that tell us who made it. So we can say, okay, well, this piece of ironstone was made, you know, in this place on this date. So then you can get a good date for your archaeological site. Prehistoric or pre-contact artifacts aren't necessarily as easy. There's a little more guesswork and a little more research that needs to be done because they don't have catalogs to tell you exactly where something was made and when, but it's still fun. I call it, you know, it's like archaeology or, you know, artifact CSI. It's detective work. So I like artifacts, obviously. If you also like artifacts and you're not an archaeologist, I wanted to talk to you about artifact collecting. And I'm not here to tell you, no, it's bad, don't do it. In fact, if you want to collect, please do. We encourage you to be responsible about it. So it's not illegal to collect artifacts in Indiana. There are a couple caveats though. You have to make sure you have landowner permission. If the landowner has not given you permission to collect artifacts on their land, then you're technically trespassing. The landowner also has first rights to those artifacts. So if you are collecting on someone else's land with permission and they want to keep what you find, they can. I don't get it as an archaeologist. You don't get it as the collector. They get it as the landowner. Now there's exceptions, like if there's any burials or anything like that, but most generally they get first dibs. So can I buy and sell artifacts? Our office does not advocate this. The reason we do not advocate selling artifacts is that it then creates a market for them and then looting happens. And then we lose information about the past. When looting occurs, we don't know where those artifacts came from. And so we can't tell as much about them. They might be beautiful, but we don't know the context or the history of them and why they were where they were. So we lose information. So we don't advocate selling artifacts because it creates a market. We don't advocate buying artifacts because you are perpetuating that market, but then also you might accidentally get yourself in trouble. So in 2008, Indiana changed its laws regarding artifact collecting. And they say that a person who knowingly or intentionally receives, retains, or disposes of an artifact, a burial object, or human remains is in violation of Indiana code and is committing possession of looted property. So you don't want to so if you don't know where the artifact that you're buying came from, you might be getting yourself into trouble. We don't want that for you. Now, if you do want to collect and you have permission and you're good to go, please keep records. Keep that information, like get a topo map or topography map and write down where you found that stuff. And then if there's ever a question or it might be a more significant site, you know exactly where that came from. So that helps us and helps you. In Indiana, you cannot intentionally dig for artifacts as a non-professional. You can only surface collect. So please keep that in mind and keep yourself out of trouble. Please help us. If you know or see damage or looting to an archaeological site, please call our office or a DNR conservation officer and let them know. There's only 5 archaeologists in my office. We can't cover all 92 counties by ourselves. So if you see something, let us know. We would really appreciate it. So if you are interested in archaeology and you want to learn more and get more involved, I've got some tips for you. So like I said, learn more and keep up to date. There's so many ways of doing this nowadays. There's the internet, which I'll give you some tips on. There's resources and publications. Our office's website is a great place to start to get guidance on where to go to find other information. If you know of locations of very interesting archaeological sites, or if you watch a presentation like this and are inspired by something or learn something, share it with others, share it with us. We want to know, others want to know. There's no point in keeping this information secret. If you are so inclined, join an avocational archaeology group. These groups aren't professionals, but they advocate the things that we as professionals really appreciate, such as wise collecting of artifacts and the proper recording of sites. And it's never too late to go to school. Even if you just take an intro to archaeology class or something similar, it's fun to learn. At least I think so. So many universities and colleges in our state have archaeology or anthropology courses. I went to the University of Indianapolis on the south side of Indianapolis. I loved my time in my program. My office regularly partners with Ball State University on archaeological projects, Indiana State University, University of Evansville, Notre Dame. I pretty much think there's at least a small anthropology or archaeology department at pretty much all of our universities and colleges. So you have options. You can visit so many places in Indiana to learn more about archaeology. So we have Angel Mounds in Evansville, we have Mound State Park in Anderson, the Glenn Black Lab in Indiana University, the Indiana State Museum, Strawtown Cotiwi Park, which is north of Noblesville near Cicero, Indiana, Fort Wahyontnon in Lafayette. Obviously, right now, things are a little bit different and it's harder to visit places, but if you can, get out and explore. Mound State Park is a state park, so there's a lot to do there than just see the archaeological site. So you have options if you are interested. As far as accessing information via the internet and email, there's all kinds of web pages and blogs about archaeology. There's e-lists and e-newsletters. The Division of Historic Preservation and Archaeology has their own e-lists and e-newsletters. You may have even heard about this presentation from one of those if you're already signed up. We've done Facebook chats as a division before. We have an active Facebook page for archaeology and historic structures. There's the universities that have archaeology programs. Most of them have their own Facebook pages. And, you know, this whole, the COVID situation has put a damper on a lot of things this year. But one thing that has become really prolific are these virtual presentations, kind of like this one. And I think virtual presentations are really neat in that a lot of them are free. A lot of them are on topics or in areas that you may not have been able to access in the past. So if you see these being promoted, take advantage of it while you can. I'm sure that virtual presentations will be a regular part of life going forward, but there's so much you can learn from them, and might as well use the resource while it's available. So I promised you more information on shipwrecks. So if you go to the website that you see on this page, or if you just Google Indiana DNR shipwrecks, and it will take you to this. But this is a website that has been developed that shows you 3D models of the shipwrecks that we have in Lake Michigan. So they've been archaeologically studied and documented, and then these 3D models were developed. So one is now even I believe a nature preserve. So there's been a lot of work done on shipwrecks recently here in Indiana, and this is just a really cool perspective on that resource. When we can get back together, I highly suggest attending any public presentations or symposiums that you can find access to. Our office tries to put on a symposium every other year or so called the Indiana Public Archaeology Symposium. These photos are from that a couple years ago. That is Indiana State Archaeologist Amy Johnson at the podium there, and then staff archaeologist Kathy Drager-Williams in the red shirt on the right. So we're there, we're accessible, and I think the people that attend these learn a lot. So both professionals and the public attend these presentations. One of the initiatives of our office is outreach. We want to educate the public about the fact that there is archaeology in our state. It's important. We need to protect it. And so some of the ways we've done that is by creating Indiana Archaeology Month every September. So happy Archaeology Month to you, and although it's almost over. We also do presentations just like this one throughout the year. So if you are part of an organization that would like a speaker, you can contact our office and we'll come talk to you. We've got more topics than just general archaeology. So we can help you out and be present for that, or do a virtual presentation. We have a number of publications that are available through the website, such as the Archaeology News, our e-newsletter, Early Peoples of Indiana. The cover of it is on the far right there. That is a publication that we have that goes into much, much more detail on those pre-contact cultures that I mentioned before. We also have an academic journal for the public called Indiana Archaeology that's available through our website. And finally, we have our little friend, Dr. Henry, professional archaeologist. He's the little guy in the hat you see in the center of the screen. He's basically our version of Flat Stanley, and we send him on adventures on our behalf if we can't make it somewhere, and he makes a presence on Facebook. So as I said, Indiana Archaeology Month is every September. We highlight archaeology during September because we want to educate the public about archaeology in our state. Every year we have a different theme, and this year's theme were rural schoolhouses of Indiana. And this also happens to be the 25th anniversary of Archaeology Month. So you can see our poster there. Typically, if this was a regular year, we'd have posters to hand out and t-shirts for purchase, but unfortunately, you just get the image on the screen. So if you like the image, you can download it off our website and print it off and make your own poster, I suppose. So in summary, archaeology does happen in our state, and archaeological projects are being conducted probably more often than you think. We're sneaky and behind the scenes. Archaeology is conducted in various settings. There's academic archaeology, governmental archaeology, and cultural resources management, which is archaeology done because of that Section 106 that I talked about before. The prehistory of Indiana ranges from about 10,000 BC to about 1650 AD. So we have a long prehistory and a lot to learn about it. Archaeological sites are protected by Indiana laws, but archaeology isn't limited to professionals. There's many ways you can also become involved. So if you have any questions, you can contact our office either by phone or through our Facebook page, and we will be happy to assist you. Stumbled on my own title. Happy Archaeology Month, and I hope you enjoy the presentation.